I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, 'My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.' Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. A traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert." Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And on the pedestal these words appear, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
Well, that's one version of the life and times of ancient Egypt. Actually, Ozymandias is a sort of a Greek corruption of part of the name of Ramesses II. His real name is Usamatra, and the Greeks mucked it about a bit. This is his temple I'm clambering over, but the Greeks didn't know that. They thought it was the palace of a guy called Memnon. By the time that Egyptologists had worked out this temple really had been made by Ramesses II, European culture had changed from that sort of rosy romanticism of the poem to good, honest, patriotic imperialism. Ramesses II, they could read, was a mighty warrior, maker of empires in Asia, and a really sort of big hero of early imperialism. Ramesses the Great's imperial reputation held together quite well for a long time. Ominously, in the 30s, some German Egyptologists started worrying about the rank and title of his officer corps, though. And it slowly began to dawn on people. Was this guy an imperialist? A totalitarian? And then in the 60s, after the Cold War, Lord Clark called him a megalomaniac. It was the end of the road for Ramesses. But if you want my opinion on the subject, we know practically nothing about the guy. We know nothing about most of the kings of ancient Egypt. They had no personality cult going at all. You know, these different Egyptological attitudes are still very much with us. I've worked for 3 different expeditions in my time. I've worked with Americans, I've worked with English people, and I've worked with Germans. And they all have a different ancient Egypt. It's as if their different nationalities had reflected into their subject and given us 3 completely different ancient worlds. In these films, I'm going plum picking, travelling to places for which I have a particular passion. Egyptologists are often drawn to places which seem to fulfil their own interpretations, and often their prejudices. I used to work with a bloke who once excavated on the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem. Oh, blimey, I said, that must have been interesting. Yes, it was, he said. We were excavating a Roman cemetery, about the first cemetery, mainly crucified people. It was fascinating. Oh, yes, I said, must have found out a lot about crucifixion, huh? He said, yeah, we said, it's a funny thing. He said, we found a coffin, and on the lid it said, Jesus by Joseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. Good Lord, I said, that must have been interesting. Did you publish it? No, he said, we found hundreds and hundreds of burials. We just gave a general description of the site. I said, but you couldn't have found many with Jesus by Joseph on the lid. Blimey, it could have been the Jesus. And he looked at me and he said, no, it couldn't have been the Jesus. He went to heaven. This is Abydos, the place where the souls of the ancient dead gather. Strange place. When we get there, nothing much to see, just the landscape. You can sort of feel it. I don't know. This is better seen in books. It's a strange, mysterious place. You can't photograph it. It's like grabbing hold of the spirits. And yet, in their way, the ancient Egyptians always picked a special landscape. They always picked a special place. And you've got to come here. You've got to see it. You've got to feel it. And this is perhaps one of the most holy landscapes in Egypt. The place where the power of the dead, the ancient dead, gathered once a year. This crack, the dead come through it like a roaring of the wind. Abydos. It really is an ancient magic place. That was a small part of the Egyptian desert. It'll preserve practically anything, but you can't grow much in it. The ancient Egyptians just came here to bury their dead and to quarry stone out of it. They lived down by the river. An ancient Greek visitor, Herodotus, described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, and it really is. For the river has made this country a valley oasis running through the Sahara, fed by the melting snows of Ethiopia. Even the soil is a gift of the river. Water is the very soul of this country. It made the land, the people, and more importantly, the gods. The ancient Egyptians had many different ideas about how their world had been created. But all of them started with water, the primeval waters of chaos. And out of these waters, a mound of earth arose, like the little hillocks that appear in the fields when the inundation is going down. This mound became the stage of the numerous ancient creation dramas. Here it was that the gods were created, the sky, the earth, the heavens, the atmosphere. Everything the ancient world was made of was made here. And in their turn, many of the temples had their own primeval waters by them. And these are called the sacred lakes. And that's a marvellous thing about ancient Egypt. It multiplied and magnified all the time. Every sacred lake contains the primeval water, just like every temple is the first building on earth. Yeah, well, all right, it's another desert. But this one really holds something beautiful. A cemetery full of fragile treasures. Evidence telling us so much about how the ancient Egyptians made their nation. And there's still a whole lot more just under the ground. It's just as well visitors aren't encouraged. Stories of the ancient Egyptians emerging from the primeval waters of chaos might have been okay in the old days, but it doesn't hold much water with Egyptologists. They want something a bit more concrete. They want to see the hole from which the rabbit came. And these are some of the holes. This is the cemetery, the town of Nagada, one of the first urban centres in ancient Egyptian history. It was found by a wonderful old Englishman, William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Dug out 5,000 graves here in 1895. Most of them were pretty well preserved. Look, I just collected these little treasures from around here, just within a few meters. These wavy handle pots, the ones that Petrie used by careful study to put all of the prehistory that he discovered into some sort of order, because they changed in size as they changed in date. And this, well, this was a little cylindrical pot. Normally they were carried around in little string bags. Here the artist has drawn the strings on the side of the pot. This one, well, that's just the potter's mark from 6,000 years ago. And this is the morning's masterpiece. It's a fine lump of a black top pot. These pots weren't made on the wheel, but by hand, very carefully polished with a stone. At the top, they put in a lustrous metallic ore to make this black finish. It's nice to think that really they held the first food offerings ever left by the ancient Egyptians for their dead. Six and a half thousand years ago, there was another settlement here, which grew and prospered till it became one of the first towns of ancient Egypt. That is Nagada village, built on the edge of the desert between the fertile Nile plain and the hot sand beyond, which holds the ancient cemetery. And it's here that ancient Egypt's greatest social experiment reached its conclusion, when society changed from tribes who hunted the animals of the Nile Valley and gathered wild grains to settled communities of people.
وهو إذا كان داوم قاعد مسؤوليها وما عمرنا فيها لو رحنا هو أنا رحت لقيت الست المغاربة دي ما في ولا ما يجي إلا غير واحد
والله درت لك العمالة تقفي باللي هدي
this change from hunting and gathering to living in communities which domesticated animals and irrigated and planted fields is actually one of the most basic that the human race has ever made. But as the ancient village got more and more sophisticated, more and more elaborate, people began to specialise in various occupations. Some people gathered the food, others made pots, some made the special ritual vessels for the shrines and the graveyards, and some inevitably supervised. It was the beginning of the class system. It was also the foundations of ancient Egyptian society. What Petrie had found at Nagada was a sort of missing link between the Stone Age Egypt and Pharaonic Egypt. But it still didn't answer the question how it was that Pharaonic Egypt had sort of exploded into being, come alive with such incredible swiftness and magnificence. Petrie thought he'd found the answer in the cemetery. He divided the skulls in the graves into two different shapes, sort of roundy heads and pointy heads. And he believed that one group of these heads had invaded the country from Mesopotamia and sort of brought a superior culture along with them, where they ruled the Egyptians from. It's really an imperialist theory for an imperialist age, and it's not one that we subscribe to today. Today, Egypt is ruled from Cairo and has been for 1,000 years. Those people at Nagada ruled themselves, one of many communities scattered up and down the Nile. They were eventually unified and ruled from Memphis. Actually, Memphis was the first capital city in the world. The Egyptians invented the idea of the state. And that's a concept that the populace finds hard to embrace. After all, village life revolves around the parish pump. A friend of mine told me a lovely story about an old man from his village. Seems the old man bought himself a radio and took it back to his house, switched it on, and the announcer said, "This is Cairo." So the old man took it back to the shop because he said he wanted a radio that said, "This is the name of his village." I think regionalism is a great curse to central government. It must have been an even bigger curse to the first central government, the King of Egypt. Solved it in an interesting way, though. As they conquered Egypt, they conquered each town. They also conquered the temples with the gods in. And the king made himself the sole representative between the people and the gods. So that, although the gods were regionalised, the king was the people's representative of all Egypt for their gods. It put him in a completely powerful, supranational situation. So, as the sole representative of the gods on earth, the king also took a lot of their qualities over. He became defined with the growing crops, with the flooding river, the stars and the sun going over in the sky. So when he died, he also entered into these eternal rhythms. And it was fitting that the king of men, and eventually the king of the gods, was buried where the sun went down on the western horizon, and his tomb marked that spot. The early kings of Egypt ruled their country not from a capital city, but from the royal residence itself, probably a portable structure which they took with them around the country. And as the seat of the royal power, of course, it had to have a distinctive style and shape, one that engraved itself on the people's consciousness. And their funerary temples, they duplicated the same form. This is one, built here at Abydos, for a second dynasty king about 2800 BC. Has all the features that the royal palace probably had. All of the early royal palaces must have looked much like this. great rectangles set in the desert, each side decorated with these rows of niches. Originally they were painted with great patterns from the carpets which hung on the sides of the royal palaces. Must have been a terrifying image of power for people who lived, after all, in tiny little mud huts and villages.
So the king became a single element that bound the nation together, the lens that focused the attentions of the gods on the land. The king was Egypt, and during the rule of one monarch, Djoser of the Third Dynasty, this royal power was held in the midst of the first stone buildings ever made.
Good King Djoser is still in his box, or serdab as it's called. When his mortuary temple was running, the priests used to come down here and have little pots of incense which smouldered, little ceramic lids, and they'd open it and blow the smoke through to the god. Incense is a real medium between man and the gods. I know he's not there actually, only the power of his great spirit. Djoser's burial chamber was excavated by two English chaps, and they found the royal foot, took it back to London. It was in a museum. Unfortunately, it was hit by a bomb, and good King Djoser became a victim of the Second World War.
But however many mummies you take away from Egypt, the presence of the dead remains. From his stepped pyramid, Djoser still spreads his power throughout the land because he was buried by his priests according to the exacting rites and rituals of the land.
Now, I'm going to kick the bucket, fall off the twig, and all those other lovely modern aphorisms are dying. Well, the ancient Egyptians had theirs too. One of the most potent was called passing through the field of reeds.
All human societies fashion their images of death out of the landscape they inhabit.
The Greeks went across the river Styx down into Hades. Elvis Presley went up to heaven. Well, the Egyptians had the desert and the river, and between their own fields and these reeds. And death is a journey from the cultivation, from the towns and through to the desert. So, of course, that makes me now officially dead. These columns are full-scale models in stone of the pillars of reeds which supported the palaces and storehouses in Memphis. They're also the first columns ever made. And isn't it interesting that they use the images of reeds for them? Because at this point in the pyramid enclosure, between the entrance and the sacred realms of the dead, where the spirit of Djoser inhabited, we have the same sort of analogy going with the field of reeds that we have by the Nile, where the corpses were brought from the river, through the fields of reeds and up to the cemetery beyond. It is, in fact, the transition between life and death. By tradition, the kings of the first two dynasties had made their tombs mastaba-shaped. And at Memphis, they placed them right along the horizon, so that they could be seen from the town of Memphis below, dominating. Trouble was, at the time of King Djoser, who was the first king of the Third Dynasty, the horizon was fresh used up. And so his architects, after they designed the regular mastaba, seemed to have designed a system by which it could be seen even from the position further back. And that was by putting another mastaba shape on top of the first one, and then by putting further stages on the top, in a series of steps. And in doing this, they actually invented the pyramid. About 2600 BC, the entire Egyptian nation worked here for about 100 years. They cut and they quarried and they chipped and they chiseled and they dragged all the stone together to make great pyramids. This is the Plateau of Giza. It's cosmic architecture. It's a bit like the houses in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the great lords and dukes laid those gardens across the landscape. And here, the Egyptians were imposing their will, struggling with the earth to make the great tombs of their kings.
For the workforce that built the royal pyramids, and they made more than 70 of them, the pyramids represented above everything the celebration of Egypt's nationhood. Old Cecil B. DeMille's whips and Victor Mature in chains could never have made anything so fine, so charged. This work takes enormous conviction, effort, organisation, and as they carved their way through the landscape, so they made their monuments, so they proved the nation.
There are quarries like this all around the pyramids at Giza. This one was taken over by some priests and used for their tombs. And this is one of the priest's little tombs. And here's his names and his titles over the door. His spirit still lives inside. But when he was alive, he served the pyramid. Well, here we are, the biggest razor blade sharpener in the world. Well, that's what the pyramid idiots say. They're these guys who have taken all the power and mystery of the place and shrunk it down to size so that now it helps you grow carrots, it straightens your sex life out, does all sorts of ways, sharpens razor blades. Of course, it does much more than that, and we're going to go up it and have a look now. But the fact we can go up all 500 feet of it is thanks, actually, to the Caliphs of Cairo. And they stripped off all the stone off the side of the pyramids. It used to be beautiful, smooth, white, gleaming object. Well, it isn't anymore. It looks pretty rough. Actually, it's not as rough as you might think, because it's quite incredibly accurately cut. Look at this. It's so accurate, this crack, you can't get a cigarette paper into it. And the whole thing, the whole pyramid, is all made like that. Now, it's 755 feet down each side of this, and the maximum error between the four sides was 7 inches. It really made the clerk of works jump on his bowler, wouldn't it? You know, I do most of my Egyptology in holes in the ground, now I know why. You know, I can't believe the Egyptians built all this just for some security device, like some Egyptologists have said. I think the pyramids are more of an expression of some sort of feeling of agoraphobia for the royal dead, you know? They sort of bound them all up and put them in coffins and jammed them in a sarcophagi. If we could lift the lid off of this, we could see what I meant. Actually, there's a place over there we can actually do that. Well, this is what it's like inside. Actually, you can see here, there are two of them. Probably one for the master, one for his wife. It's not actually a royal one, but it's much the same. Basic principle is that all of them are shaped like houses. That's how the ancient Egyptians saw them, really. It's houses for the dead. Anyway, let's see how they are for size. Actually, this is the wife's. I think that would be a bit difficult to raise. Let's see. Oh, blimey. I think it fits. That's a bad sign. So, you see, King would have laid here like this for all eternity. And over him, stretched right down the sarcophagus lid, is a carving of the goddess Nut. She's a beautiful lady. She's the goddess of the night sky, and she has big stars all down her dress. And the king laid in here with Nut in an act of union, like this. And this procreation meant that the king was actually recreating himself. It's a very complicated creation idea. Oh, it's much better in here than climbing up that pyramid. Well, here we are, almost at the top, about 480 feet. Actually, the entrance is down the bottom. They all are, all in the same place in every pyramid, so it wouldn't be much good for keeping robbers out, would they? And as they dragged their great cedar coffins down these small corridors, the priests actually thought they were performing an act as potent as the insertion of rods into a nuclear reactor. This slot had a great slab of granite, which was lowered like a portcullis in a medieval castle after the funeral. Actually, there are 3 of them in this corridor. There are 3 in most corridors and most pyramids, but they didn't stop the robbers. They're really a ritual form of protection. They are the last barriers before we come to the burial chamber. Here, the ancient Egyptians wrote some of their symbols of potency. These texts are written on the door jamb to the chambers which lie under the centre of the pyramid. They describe the gates of heaven. They say that the gates are bolted with bolts shaped like the penises of baboons, one of the most powerful symbols the Egyptians had for fertility. This is the oldest religious book in the world. Bits of it fairly obscure. Most of the texts in this room talk about the establishment of the king in the other world. This is vital for the Egyptians to get their king fully established with the other gods, because only when the king is established as a king in heaven can the real power of the other world be taken from there back into the land of Egypt. And that's what pyramid building is all about. And the king went to heaven in a multitude of different ways. He went as a dust cloud, he went in a puff of incense, he jumped up as a grasshopper, even climbed up a ladder. When he got there, the gods did different things to it. Some greeted him like a friend, others he had to serve like a scribe, and some were even eaten by him. For the Egyptians, it was vital that the dead king should go to the next world because he would be their representative in it and keep the power going through the land there. Look at the spaces between the pyramids and you'll feel that they're going up towards the sky, and the sky, more importantly, is coming down to them. And it's a unity between God and man, and it's a covenant between a state and the gods of the state. Well, this pyramid's the biggest pyramid. In fact, it's the biggest stone building in the world. But that guy over there, he built his pyramid on a little bit higher ground. And it's called the Greatest, so we all know where he's at. But this one really is the greatest. This is the Pyramid of King Khufu. And its full name is Khufu's Pyramid, the pyramid at the place of sunrise and sunset.